Hi, my name is Peter Barassa, and I'm with MMRsite.com. I'm here in Loudon at the Loudon Oval Vintage Car Festival with Jerry Lettieri and his beautiful Allard J2 Prototype. It's a 1949 car, and could you tell us a little bit more about it?
Allard was a British manufacturer who had built a few cars before the war, but after the war he decided to build a competition car, using American components in a British chassis. And he looked for American engines. They were big, they were powerful, and this is his first attempt at a competition car. This car was built in '49. It was sent to New York City to the original owner, who was Zora Arkus-Duntov. Duntov was you're familiar with that name, with the Corvettes and everything? Well, before Corvette, he was tied in with Allard. He had designed these Ardun overhead valve heads for a Ford flathead V8 and had this motor put in the car and immediately went to Watkins Glen with it as the test for, actually the racing test for the Ardun heads, and probably the introduction of the J2 Allard in America. It did not finish the race, but it caused quite a sensation. It was photographed and pictured in quite a few books and magazines and so on. He did a few more things with it, went to some other races, and
well, this looks to be an all-aluminum handmade chassis body. Is the chassis aluminum also?
No, the chassis is steel. It's a fabricated steel chassis. Uses
a tube frame or
it's a rail frame, but it uses mostly Ford components with some additions. If you look at the front, if we can go around to the front, they took a typical Ford front axle, cut it in half and pinned it.
Okay. And
made an independent suspension out of that. They did the same in the back. They took a modified Ford rear end and they made independent suspension out of that. Okay. And soon after that, the J2s were selling quite a bit in the U.S. They were raced all over. They put Cadillac motors in them, Chrysler motors. They were extremely fast and extremely dangerous. There were quite a few fatalities with these.
But this car had a couple of unique features in terms of the time even. The combination of the American engine and the rear suspension, which is quite different from the period, which is probably a solid axle, was probably the race
solid axle was common in just about everything, right?
And this would have raced against Jaguar, like the 120s.
Correct, right.
So how is the rear end different? How is the
rear end is a Ford center section, and it's modified. It has a DD-owned independent suspension. There's a big bar around the back that supports the suspension, and it has small short axles with U-joints on each end, so it allows the wheels to go up and down independently. Now the front with the pinned axle is sort of an independent suspension, but the axle being pinned in the middle, what happens with the front wheels, they don't go up and down, they go in. As the car goes up, it pivots on these axles and the wheels go in. And because of that, like an old Volkswagen, you would see that sometimes in a Volkswagen. If you got into trouble and got this thing up in the air, the wheels could go in quite a bit and you would come down, and that was one of the danger points with these. But they were quick, they were fast, but they were
a handful.
They were a handful.
I'm looking at these heads for a second, and I don't think I've ever seen anything like this on a Ford engine, but are these hemispherical combustion?
These are hemispherical, right.
So how much was the horsepower change?
The original motor was 100 horsepower. These probably added 50 or 60 horsepower just by bolting them onto the motor.
That's unbelievable.
Without doing anything else.
Yeah.
It allowed the car to breathe much better. If you look at it, has huge intake ports, huge exhaust ports, big valves. It's a retrofit, so it wasn't as reliable as they would hoped it would be.
Right. And what's the weight of a car like this?
I would say this car probably weighs a little under 2,000 pounds, maybe 1,800, 1,700.
So looking at the competition of the day, if this was being compared with a 120 Jag, you're comparing a V8 against a straight 6.
Right.
And the 120 is probably a slightly heavier car.
Correct.
So this car had a tremendous advantage on the straights.
Well, they did, and that's why the Allards won.
Okay.
But they were a handful. But they were very successful. They won Watkins Glen. They won a lot of road races.
How long have you owned this car?
I've owned this about 12 years.
Did you look for one of these things to buy, or how
I
did this
had
come to
one.
you?
I had one before. I had found one in a barn, an older Allard. It was an old dirty barn find. I chased it for about 20 years. I finally was able to buy it. I used to go out in the back, and I have a barn. I used to go out in the barn and look at it and say, you know, this would be neat if it had an Ardun Ford conversion in it instead of a flathead.
Right.
And I used to think that, being a hot rodder, I thought that would have been the, you know, the motor to have. So I did nothing with the car. It just sat in the barn for a year or two, and one day I'm reading Hemmings and I see for sale an Allard with an Ardun conversion in it. So I made a few phone calls. I flew out, went to look at the car.
Where was the car?
Car was in Chicago.
Okay.
Went to look at it, learned a little bit about its history, and I said, this is pretty interesting. I bought it and sold my other Allard.
Wow.
And that's how it came to be.
How do you use this car now?
I use it in events like this, some track events, some hill climb events. I did get it to Watkins Glen in the year 1999, which was the 50th anniversary of its first race in America.
Right.
I got it to Mount Equinox, a hill climb, in 2001, which was its 50th anniversary of running at Mount Equinox. I've had it at the Glen a couple times at the Vintage Festival.
Wow.
So
this car is still being used. I mean,
still being used to a degree, right.
You know, one of the things that we're trying to do on our series is show motoring moments of people who are still using their cars no matter what. They're drivers. And so, would you say this car could be driven on the road?
Yes.
It could.
It has lights and a horn and no wipers or anything and no windshield. But yes, it's really a road course car. It's a sports car that has to have certain features, lights and things like that, brake lights. And you could.
I see.
I mean, you can start it and stop it. It has a clutch. It has a transmission.
Well, since it's a prototype, I can understand how it might be short some of the amenities that we might expect. But was this ever made into a road-going sports car?
Some of the later ones were. This one wasn't.
Right.
Some of the later J2s were.
Jerry, thank you very much for being with us and for sharing this beautiful car with us. It's an incredible piece of history, and we really appreciate you bringing it out and letting us talk to you about it. Thank you so much.
Thanks. Okay, Peter. Thank you.
If you folks enjoyed this interview, I'm sure that if you go to MMRsite.com or to YouTube and dial in Peter Bourassa, you'll find other interviews of similar interesting cars. Thank you for being with us.